Chapter 1. The Three Presents of Monsieur d'Artagnan the Father. On the first Monday of the month of April, 1625, the small town of Meung, the birthplace of the author of the Romance of the Rose, appeared to be in a state of revolution, as complete as if the Huguenots were come to make a second siege of La Rochelle. Many of the townsmen, observing the flight along the high street of women who left their children to squall at the doorsteps, hastened to don their armor, and, fortifying their courage, which was inclined to fail, with a musket or a partisan, proceeded toward the inn of the Jolly Miller, to which a vast and accumulating mob was hastening with intense curiosity. At that period alarms were frequent, and few days passed without some bourg or other registering in its archives an event of this description. There were the nobles who made war on each other. There was the king who made war on the cardinal. There was the Spaniard who made war on the king. Then, besides these wars, concealed or overt, secret or public, there were bandits, mendicants, Huguenots, wolves, and lackeys who made war on the whole world. The townsmen always armed themselves against the bandits, the wolves, and the lackeys, frequently against the nobles and the Huguenots, sometimes against the king, but never against the cardinal or the Spaniard. From this custom, therefore, it arose that on the aforesaid first Monday in the month of April 1625, the burghers, hearing a noise and seeing neither the yellow and the red flag nor the livery of the Duke of Richelieu, rushed toward the inn of the Jolly Miller. Having reached it, every one could see and understand the cause of this alarm. A young man, but let us trace his portrait with one stroke of the pen. Fancy to yourselves Don Quixote at 18, Don Quixote peeled without his coat of mail or greaves, Don Quixote clothed in a woolen doublet, whose blue color was changed to an undyeable shade, a shade between the lees of wine and a cerulean blue. The countenance long and brown, the cheekbones high, denoting acuteness, the muscles of the jaw enormously developed, an infallible mark by which a Gascon might be recognized, even without the cap, and our youth wore a cap adorned with a sort of feather, the eye full and intelligent, the nose hooked but finely formed, the whole figure too large for a youth, yet too small for an adult. An inexperienced eye would have taken him for the son of a farmer on a journey, had it not been for the long sword which, hanging from a leathern belt, banged against the heels of its owner while he was walking, and against the rough coat of his steed when he was mounted, for our youth had a steed, and this steed was at the same time so remarkable as to attract observation. It was a Bernese Sheltie of about 12 or 14 years of age, yellow as an orange without any hair on its tail, but abundance of galls on its legs, and which, whilst carrying its head lower than its knees, making the application of a martingale unnecessary, yet managed gallantly in its 8 leagues a day. Unfortunately, these youthful qualities of the steed were so well concealed under its strange coat and eccentric gait, that at a time when everyone knew something of horses, the apparition of the aforesaid Sheltie at Meung, which it had entered about a quarter of an hour before by the gate of Beaugency, produced a somewhat unfavorable sensation or impression, which extended even to its master, and this impression was the more painful to young D'Artagnan, for that was the name of the Don Quixote of this second Rosinante, that he could not conceal from himself the ridiculous light in which he, albeit so good a horseman, was placed by such a steed. He had, therefore, sighed deeply when he accepted the gift from Monsieur d'Artagnan, his father. He knew that such a beast was worth about 20 francs. It is true that the words which accompanied the present were above price. "My son," said the Gascon gentleman, in that pure Bernese patois or dialect which Henry IV could never entirely shake off, "my son, this horse was born in the paternal homestead about 13 years ago, and has remained in it ever since, which ought to make you regard it with affection. Never sell it, let it die honorably of old age and tranquillity, and should you make a campaign with it, take as much care of it as you would of an old servant. At the court, if you should ever have the honor to be presented, an honor, however, to which your long line of noble ancestors entitles you, support with dignity the name of gentleman which has been honorably borne by your ancestors for the sake of you and yours for more than 500 years. Never submit quietly to the slightest indignity, except it proceed from the cardinal or the king. It is by his courage, mark this well, it is his courage alone that a gentleman makes his way nowadays. Whoever hesitates one moment, lets perhaps that chance escape him which fortune for that moment alone has offered him. You are young and ought to be brave for 2 reasons. The first, because you are a garçon. The second, because you are my son. Have no fear of the many imbroglios, and look about for adventures. You have been taught to handle the sword. You have muscles of iron, a wrist like steel. Fight whenever you can, the more so because duels are forbidden, and consequently it requires twice as much courage to fight. I have to give you but 15 crowns, my son, besides the horse, and the advice which you have heard. Your mother will add to them the recipe for a certain balsam, which she received from a Bohemian woman, and which has the miraculous power of curing every wound which has fallen short of the heart. Take advantage of all, and live long and happily. I have only one more word to add, and it is the offer of an example. Not my own, for I've never been at court. I've only served in the religious wars as a volunteer. I wish to speak of you of Monsieur de Treville, once my neighbor, who has had the honor of playing, whilst a boy, with our king, Louis XIII, whom God preserve. Sometimes their play turned to battles, and in these battles the king did not always conquer. Yet his conquests by Monsieur de Treville imbued him with a great deal of esteem and friendship for him. Afterwards, Monsieur de Treville fought other battles. Indeed, merely during his journey to Paris, he fought 5 times from the death of the late monarch to the majority of the young king. He has fought 7 times without reckoning campaigns and sieges, and since that majority till now perhaps 100 times. And yet, in spite of edicts, ordinances, and writs, behold him now captain of the Musketeers, that is, chief of a legion of Caesars, upon which the king mainly depends, and who are feared by the cardinal, who, as everyone knows, is not easily alarmed. Moreover, Monsieur de Treville gains 10,000 crowns a year, and therefore is a man of consequence. He began the world as you do. Go to him with this letter, and let your conduct be regulated by him, that you may meet with the same results. Hereupon Monsieur d'Artagnan, the father, girded his own sword upon his son, tenderly kissed him on either cheek, and gave him his blessing. Leaving the paternal chamber, the young man found his mother waiting with the famous recipe, which, from the advice he had just received, it seemed very probable that he would require to use pretty often. The adieus were longer and more tender on this side than on the other. Not but that Monsieur d'Artagnan loved his son, who was his only child, but that Monsieur d'Artagnan was a man who would have considered it unworthy of himself to give way to any sentiment, whilst Madame d'Artagnan was a woman, and what is more, a mother. She wept much, and to the credit of Monsieur d'Artagnan the younger, we may as well say that whatever efforts he made to remain firm, as became the future musketeer, nature gained the day, and he shed many tears, some of which he had great difficulty in concealing. Our youth took his way the same day, furnished with the 3 paternal gifts, which were, as we have said, the 15 crowns, the steed, and the letter to Monsieur de Treville. As may well be imagined, the advice was thrown into the bargain. With such a vade-mecum, D'Artagnan found himself, morally and physically, the counterpart of the hero of Cervantes, to whom we so happily compared him, when our duty as his historian obliged us to draw his portrait. Don Quixote took windmills for giants and sheep for armies. D'Artagnan considered every smile an insult and every look a provocation. Therefore, his fist was doubled from Tarbes to Meun, and from one cause to another his hand was upon the pommel of his sword 10 times a day. However, the fist did not descend upon any jaw, nor did the sword leave its scabbard. It was not that the unlucky yellow sheltie did not excite many a smile on the countenances of passers-by, but as beside the yellow sheltie clashed a sword of respectable length, and above the sword glistened an eye rather stern than fierce. The wayfarers repressed their mirth, or, if their mirth surpassed their prudence, they took care only to laugh on one side of their faces, like the ancient masks. D'Artagnan, therefore, remained dignified and uninterrupted in his susceptibility, even to this fatal town of Meung. But there, when he dismounted at the door of the Jolly Miller, without anyone, either landlord, waiter, or hostler, coming to aid the stirrup of his horse, D'Artagnan perceived at the open window of a room on the ground floor a gentleman of distinguished air and handsome figure, although with a countenance slightly grim, conversing with two persons who appeared to listen to him with deference. D'Artagnan naturally thought, according to his usual custom, that they were talking about him, and listened accordingly. This time, however, he was partly correct. He was not the subject of conversation, but his horse was. The gentleman appeared to be enumerating to his hearers all his qualities, and since I have said his hearers appeared to pay him great deference, they every moment laughed heartily. Now, since even the slightest smile was sufficient to rouse the anger of our youth, we may well imagine what effect such unbounded mirth was likely to produce upon him. Nevertheless, D'Artagnan wished first to examine the countenance of the impertinent fellow who thus laughed at him. He therefore fixed his stern look upon the stranger and saw a man from 40 to 45 years of age, with eyes black and piercing, complexion pale, nose strongly marked, and mustache black and carefully trimmed. He was attired in a violet-colored doublet and breeches, with points of the same color, with no other ornament than that sleeves through which the shirt passed. This doublet and these breeches, though new, displayed divers wrinkles and creases, as if they had been for some time packed up in a portmanteau. D'Artagnan made these observations with the rapidity of the most minute observer, and doubtless with an instinct which told him that this unknown was to have a vast influence on his future life. At the very moment that D'Artagnan fixed his eyes upon the gentleman with the violet doublet, that individual made one of his wisest and most profound remarks upon the Bonese Sheltie. His two auditors roared with laughter, and he himself, contrary to his usual custom, permitted a sort of sickly smile to wander over his countenance. This time there was no room for doubt. D'Artagnan was really insulted. Being convicted of this, he pulled his cap over his eyes, and trying to imitate the courtly airs which he had seen among some chance Gascon nobility in their provincial visits, he placed one hand on the guard of his sword and the other on his hip. Unfortunately, the nearer he advanced, the more angry he grew, so that instead of the high and dignified language which we had prepared to the prelude to his challenge, he found nothing at the tip of his tongue but a rough personality, which he accompanied with a furious gesture. "Hullo, sir!" he cried. "You, sir, who hide yourself behind the shutter. Yes, you. Tell me what you're laughing at, and we will laugh together." The gentleman slowly turned his eyes from the steed to his rider, as if it required some time to comprehend that these strange reproaches were addressed to himself. Then, when he could no longer doubt it, he slightly knit his brows, and after a pretty long pause, with an accent of irony and insolence impossible to describe, answered D'Artagnan, "I am not speaking to you, sir." "But I am speaking to you," cried the young man, exasperated by this mixture of insolence and good manners, this polite contempt. The unknown regarded him yet a moment with a slight smile, and then leaving the window, slowly sauntered out of the inn, and stationed himself opposite the horse at 2 paces from D'Artagnan. His calm face and jeering aspect redoubled the mirth of his companions, who still remained at the window. D'Artagnan, seeing him come out, drew his sword a foot out of its scabbard. "This horse decidedly is, or rather has been, a buttercup," continued the unknown, pursuing his remarks, and addressing his auditors at the window without appearing to notice the exasperation of D'Artagnan, who nevertheless swelled and strutted between them. "It is of a color," he continued, "well known in botany, but as yet very rare amongst horses." "A man may laugh at a horse who would not dare to laugh at its master," cried the disciple of Tréville with fury. "I do not often laugh, sir," answered the unknown, "as you may yourself discover by the expression of my countenance, but yet I mean to preserve the right of laughing when I please. And I, roared out D'Artagnan, do not permit anyone to laugh when I do not please. Really, sir, continued the unknown more quietly than ever. Well, that is sound sense. And turning on his heel, he essayed to re-enter the inn by the front door, opposite which D'Artagnan, on arriving, had observed a horse ready saddled. But D'Artagnan was not a man to let anyone who had the insolence to mock him thus escape. He therefore drew his sword and pursued him, exclaiming, "Turn, turn, master jester, that I may not strike you behind." "Strike me," said the other, quickly turning around, and regarding the youth with as much astonishment as contempt. "Go along with you, my dear boy, you are mad." Then, in a low voice, as if he were speaking to himself, he added, "It is annoying. What a prize for his majesty, who's everywhere seeking fire-eaters to recruit his guards." He had scarcely finished when D'Artagnan made such a furious thrust at him that, had he not jumped back briskly, it's probable the jest would have been his last. Perceiving now, however, that the affair was beyond a joke, the unknown drew his sword, saluted his adversary, and gravely put himself on guard, but at the same moment his two auditors, accompanied by the host, fell pell-mell upon D'Artagnan with sticks, shovels, and tongs. This caused such a complete diversion of the attack that whilst D'Artagnan himself had turned to face the shower of blows, his opponent put up his sword with the same calm as before, and from an actor became a spectator of the combat, a character which he supported with the same imperturbability, yet at the same time muttering, "Plague upon these Gascons! Put him on his orange-colored horse and let him go." "Not before I've slain you, you coward," cried D'Artagnan, all the time making the best resistance he could, and not yielding one step to his three opponents who showered their blows upon him. "Yet another Gasconade," murmured the gentleman. "Upon my word, these Gascons are incorrigible. Keep up the dance, since he actually wishes it. When he is tired, he will say that he's had enough." But the stranger did not yet know what a stubborn personage he had to deal. D'Artagnan was not the man ever to sue for a quarter. The context therefore continued for some moments longer, until at last, completely worn out, D'Artagnan dropped his sword, which was broken in two by a blow from a stick, while at the same time another blow, which cut open his forehead, stretched him on the ground almost senseless. It was now that the burghers hastened to the scene of the action. Fearing a disturbance, the landlord, assisted by his servants, carried the wounded man into the kitchen, where some care was given him. As for the stranger, he returned to the window and viewed the crowd with evident marks of impatience, seeming rather annoyed at their refusal to go away. "Well, how is that madman now?" said he, turning and addressing the host, who came to inquire in what state his guest was. "Is your excellency safe and well?" demanded the host. "Yes, perfectly so, mine host, but I wish to know what has become of this youth." "He's better," replied the host, "but he was quite senseless." "Indeed," said the gentleman. "But before he quite lost his senses, he rallied all his strength to challenge and defy you," added the landlord. "Well, this young fellow is the very devil himself," said the gentleman. "Oh, no, your excellency, oh, no," replied the host, with a contemptuous grin. "He is not the devil, for while he was senseless, we rummaged his outfit, and in his bundle we found but one shirt, and in his pocket only 12 crowns, which fact, however, did not prevent his saying, just before he fainted, that, had this happened in Paris, you should quickly have repented it, but as it has taken place here, you will not have to repent until later." "Therefore," coolly observed the stranger, "he doubtless is a prince of the blood in disguise." "I give you this information, sir," said the host, "that you may keep yourself on your guard." "And did he not name anyone in his anger?" "Yes, he slapped his pocket and said, 'We shall see what Monsieur de Treville says of this insult, offering his protégé.'" "Monsieur de Treville?" said the unknown, becoming more attentive. "He slapped his pocket and mentioned the name of Monsieur de Treville? Let us see, my good host, whilst this young man was senseless, you did not fail, I'm sure, to examine that pocket. What did it contain? A letter addressed to Monsieur de Treville, captain of the Musketeers. Really? Just as I've had the honor to tell your excellency, said the host. The latter, who had no great penetration, did not remark the expression which these words brought upon the countenance of the stranger, who now left the window-sill on which his elbow had rested and frowned like a man disturbed all of a sudden. The devil, he muttered between his teeth. Could Treville have sent this garçon? He is very young, but a thrust of a sword is a thrust of a sword, whatever may be the age of him that gives it, and one distrusts a boy less than an oldster. A slight obstacle is sufficient to thwart a project. And the stranger fell into a reverie which lasted some minutes. Come, mine host, at length he said, will you not rid me of this madman? I cannot conscientiously kill him, and yet, he added with a menacing air, he much annoys me. Where is he? In my wife's chamber on the first story, where they are dressing his wounds. Are his clothes and his bag with him? Has he taken off his doublet? On the contrary, they are below in the kitchen, said the host, but since this young madman annoys you, doubtless he causes a disturbance in your inn which no respectable people can bear. Go to your room, make out my bill, and give orders to my servants. What, sir, must you be off? Yes, I ordered you to saddle my horse. Have I not been obeyed? Yes, and your excellency may see your horse standing under the grand entrance, quite ready for the road. Very well, then do as I have ordered. Heyday, said the host to himself. Can he be afraid of this young boy? But a commanding look from the stranger cut him short. He humbly bowed and left the apartment. My lady must not see this strange fellow, said the stranger. As she's already late, she must soon pass. I'd better mount my horse and go to meet her. If I could only just learn the contents of that letter addressed to Treville. And thus, muttering, the unknown descended to the kitchen. In the meantime, the landlord, who had doubted not that his youth's presence drove the stranger from his inn, had gone to his wife's chamber and found that D'Artagnan had regained consciousness. Then, whilst he made him comprehend that the police might be severe on him for having attacked a great lord, for, according to the host's idea, the stranger could be nothing less than the great lord, he persuaded him, in spite of his weakness, to resume his journey. D'Artagnan, half stunned, without doublet, his head completely bandaged, arose and, pushed out by the host, began to descend the stairs, but on reaching the kitchen, the first object he saw was his opponent, who was quietly talking at the door of a heavy carriage, driven by two large Norman horses. The person with whom he conversed was a woman of from 20 to 22 years of age, whose head appeared, through the window of the carriage, like a picture in a frame. We've already said how rapidly D'Artagnan caught the expression of a countenance. He saw, therefore, at the first glance, that the lady was young and attractive. Now this beauty was the more striking to him, as it was completely different from that of his own southern country. She was a pale, fair person with long curling hair falling on her shoulders, large, blue, languishing eyes, rosy lips, and alabaster hands. She conversed with the unknown with great vivacity. So his eminence commands me, said she, to return immediately to England and apprise him with all speed whether the Duke has left London, said the unknown. As to my other instructions, demanded the fair traveller, they are enclosed in this box, which you will not open until you're on the other side of the channel. Good. And you? What are you going to do? I return to Paris. Without chastising this insolent boy, demanded the lady. The unknown was about to reply, but ere he could do so, D'Artagnan, who had heard every word, rushed to the doorway. It is that insolent boy, he cried, who chastises others. And I hope that this time he who deserves chastisement will not escape him. Will not escape him? Echoed the unknown, knitting his brows. No, in the presence of a woman you would hesitate to fly, I presume. Consider, said the lady, seeing the gentleman place his hand to his sword, consider that the slightest delay might ruin all. You are right, said the gentleman. You go on your way, and I will mine. And, saluting the lady with a bow, he got into the saddle, whilst the coachman whipped his horses. The lady and the gentleman therefore went off at a gallop toward the opposite ends of the street. "Hullo, your bill!" shouted mine host, whose affection for the traveller was changed to the most profound contempt when he saw him departing without paying. "Pay, rascal!" cried the traveller as he galloped off to his valet, who drew 3 or 4 pieces of silver at the feet of the landlord, and set off at a full speed the way his master went. "Oh, coward, wretch, false-hearted gentleman!" cried D'Artagnan, rushing after the valet. But he was still too feeble from his wounds to bear such an effort. Scarcely had he gone 10 paces before his ears tingled, a vertigo seized him, a cloud passed before his eyes, and he fell down in the street with a final cry of "Coward! Coward! Coward!" "He is a sad coward, verily," murmured the host, who now, approaching D'Artagnan, endeavoured to soothe him by this flattery, as the heron in the fable, her friend the snail. "Yes, a sad coward," murmured D'Artagnan, "but she is beautiful." "Who is she?" said the landlord. "My lady," murmured D'Artagnan, and again fainted away. "Never mind," said the host. "Although I've lost 2, at any rate I've secured this one, whom I'm sure of keeping for some days. At all events, I shall gain 11 crowns. It must be borne in mind that 11 crowns was the exact sum which remained in D'Artagnan's purse, and the host had reckoned upon 11 days' illness at a crown a day. On this point, however, he reckoned without his guest. The following day, D'Artagnan left his couch, went down to the kitchen, and besides certain ingredients, the names of which have not descended to posterity, demanded some wine, oil, and rosemary, which, with his mother's recipe in his hand, he compounded into a salve, wherewith he anointed his numerous wounds, renewing the plasters himself, and not allowing the interposition of any leech. Thanks, no doubt, to the Bohemian salve, and perhaps also to the absence of the leech, D'Artagnan found himself on foot in the evening, and almost cured by the next day. But at the moment he was paying for this wine, oil, and rosemary, the sole expense he had incurred, for he had been completely abstinent, whilst, on the contrary, if one believed the hustler, the yellow horse had eaten 3 times as many oats as one would have supposed possible from his size. D'Artagnan found nothing in his pocket but his little purse, with its 11 crowns. As for the letter to Monsieur de Treville, that was gone. The young man began by looking very patiently for this letter, turning out and rummaging his pockets and fobs 20 times, rummaging his valise again and again, and opening and shutting his purse. But when he was quite convinced that the letter was not to be found, he gave full vent to another fit of rage in the manner which was like to make necessary a second decoction of wine and spiced oil. For upon beholding this young scatterbrain raging and threatening to destroy everything in his establishment if the letter were not found, the host had already seized upon a spit, his wife upon the handle of a broom, and the servants upon the same weapons they had wielded the evening before. "My letter of introduction!" cried D'Artagnan. "My letter of introduction! Oh, by St. Denis, I'll spit on all of you like so many ortolans." One circumstance prevented the youth from accomplishing his threat, which was that his sword, as we have said, had unfortunately been broken in 2 in the first struggle, a mischance he had entirely forgotten. Consequently, when D'Artagnan went to draw it in earnest, he found himself armed only with the stump, about 8 or 10 inches long, while the host had carefully thrust into the scabbard. As for the rest of the blade, the cook had adroitly set it aside for a larding pin. And yet it is probable that this deception would not have stopped our fiery youth, had not the host reflected that the demand which his guest made was perfectly just. "But, after all," said he, lowering his spit, "where is this letter?" "Yes, where is the letter?" roared D'Artagnan. "And let me tell you that the letter is for Monsieur de Treville, and it must be found. Otherwise, Monsieur de Treville will know to have it found. I'll answer for it." This threat completely frightened mine host. Next to the king and the cardinal, Monsieur de Treville was the man whose name was most frequently in the mouths of the military, and indeed of the citizens. There was certainly Father Joseph, but his name was never mentioned except in an undertone, so great was the terror which his grey eminence, as the familiar of the cardinal was called, inspired. Therefore, throwing away his spit and ordering his wife to do the same with her broom handle, and the servants with their weapons, he himself set the example by commencing a diligent search for the letter. "Did this letter contain anything valuable?" said he, after some moments of fruitless search. "I should rather think it did," cried the Gascon, who calculated on the letter to make his way at court. "It contained my fortune." "Were they bills on the Bank of Spain?" demanded the host, most disturbed. "Bills on the private treasury of His Majesty," replied D'Artagnan, who, calculating on entering the king's service through this letter of introduction, thought he might, without lying, make this somewhat rash reply. "The devil!" exclaimed the host at his wit's end. "But it is of no consequence," continued D'Artagnan with his native assurance. "The money is nothing. The letter's all I want. I had rather lost 1,000 pistols than that." He might as well have made 20,000, but a certain youthful modesty restrained him. A sudden flash of light illuminated the mind of the host, who was uttering maledictions at finding nothing. "The letter's not lost!" he cried. "Isn't it?" said D'Artagnan. "No, it's been taken from you." "Taken? And by whom?" "By the stranger yesterday. He went into the kitchen where your doublet was lying. He was there for a time entirely alone, and I'll lay a wager it was he who stole it from you." "You really think so?" said D'Artagnan, only half convinced, for he knew better than anybody the strictly personal value of the letter and saw nothing in it to excite cupidity. "The fact is that none of the servants or travelers who were there could have gained anything by the theft." "You say, then," continued D'Artagnan, "that you suspect this impertinent gentleman." "I tell you that I'm quite certain of it," said the host. "When I informed him that your worship was the protégé of Monsieur de Troisville, and that you had a letter for that illustrious noble, he appeared much disturbed, demanded where the letter was, and immediately went into the kitchen where your doublet was lying." "Then he is the robber," said D'Artagnan. "I will complain to Monsieur de Troisville, and he will lay my complaint before His Majesty." And he majestically drew from his pocket 2 crowns, which he handed to the host, who followed him cap in hand to the archway, where he remounted his yellow horse, which carried him without further accident to the gate of Saint Antoine in Paris. There its owner sold the animal for 3 crowns, which was a good price, considering that D'Artagnan had overridden him in the last part of the journey. The dealer, to whom he sold the sheltie for these 9 francs, did not conceal from the young man that he paid this exorbitant sum merely on account of the originality of his color. D'Artagnan therefore entered Paris on foot, carrying his small valise under his arm, and proceeded until he found a lodging suitable to his slender resources. This chamber was a sort of garret situated in the Rue des Fossoyeurs, near the Luxembourg. Having paid the luck penny, he took possession of his lodging, and passed the remainder of the day in sewing on his doublet and breeches sundry laces which his mother had secretly taken from a nearly new doublet of the elder Monsieur de D'Artagnan. He then repaired in the Quai de Farel to procure a new blade for his sword, after which he returned to the Louvre, and learned from the first musketeer he met where Monsieur de Troisville's hotel was situated. Thus, he ascertained to be in the Rue de Vieux Colombier, that is, in the very neighborhood where he had himself taken up his abode, a circumstance which he construed into a happy omen of the success of his expedition. These matters disposed of, and satisfied with the manner in which he had behaved in Meung, without remorse for the past, confident in the present, and full of hope for the future, he went to bed and slept the sleep of the brave. This sleep, still that of a rustic, landed till 9 o'clock in the morning, the hour at which he rose to repair to the hotel of the famed Monsieur de Troisville, who, according to D'Artagnan's father, was the 3rd personage in the realm.